Okay, so I'm going to announce the second speaker, so the third speaker of the morning. And where are you, Rachel? So Rachel Hayes-Harb is a professor of linguistics at the University of Utah. And since 2019, she is also the editor-in-chief of the journal Applied Psycholinguistics and has served as the director of the Office of Undergraduate Research at the University of Utah and also served as the Associate Dean of Undergraduate Studies. Her research focuses on the acquisition of phonology of a second language as a whole by second language learners. So the research program is very broad and very exciting, and including how they develop stable phonolexical representations. And today she's going to talk to us about one of the, I think, the cornerstone of all what we do, which is the methodological solidity of our approach. So thank you and welcome, Rachel.
Thank you so much. It is so fun to spend this time with y'all. So I'd like to start off by acknowledging my collaborators. I'll be talking about some new work that I've been working on with Shannon Barrios, with whom I co-direct the Speech Acquisition Lab, and our current undergraduate collaborator, Joanne Moffett. Of course, I also want to acknowledge all the members of our lab, Imera for having us, Isabel, of course, for having this wonderful idea and making it work, and all of you for how much your work inspires me, and just for spending this time together. All right, I'd like to start off by acknowledging my own position, my commitments, and make a note about some terminological issues. I'm a white woman in a U.S. academic context. I'm a first language speaker of English, and I practice what is known as elite multilingualism. It is a privilege of mine to have multiple languages, but it has never been a necessity. And I also have English language teaching experience. So I'm acknowledging these aspects of my identities and my experiences because they necessarily shape the research questions I ask and how I go about addressing them. I endeavor in my work to interrogate harmful scholarly practices while acknowledging the role I play and have played in upholding many of these. And on a terminological note, as pointed out by Chang et al. And lots of others, the terms native and non-native are problematic on the grounds that they may cause harm to the people we use them to describe, and indeed may exacerbate the replication crisis in our fields due to their vagueness. Whenever possible, I'll avoid these terms, but of course it's really difficult to avoid them in this literature. This is a note for us moving forward. And finally, I simply acknowledge that our practice of separating languages into bounded and named entities is problematic because we do so as though they exist as bounded named entities and individuals when indeed they do not. All right, so I'm going to organize today's talk around three main questions. One has to do with the ways in which we make our arguments. We build our arguments around asymmetries in performance. And I'm going to make the point that we often observe the very same asymmetries we attribute to the very specific case of language learning in so-called native speakers. And so I'll talk about that and what kind of a problem I think it is, and we can think about how to move forward from there. Then I'll ask a question about representational fuzziness. What is it exactly? We've done some work to try to, within a small number of situations, to try to figure out, like, what exactly does it mean to be fuzzy, as opposed to being, I guess, precise? What exactly are we contrasting it with? And then finally, what role do individual learner differences play in our work? What role should they play? And where should we go from here? Okay, so I'll start with some background stuff that we all know. Learners can experience difficulty learning and processing words' phonological forms, right? And in particular when they involve so-called new phonemes and contrasts. And we use lots and lots of methodologies to observe this. And so a big question we all ask is why and how do these new phonemes and new contrasts pose the difficulty that they do? We've also come a long way in understanding the independence of perceptual and phonolexical representations. So we know that the robustness, I'm going to use lots of vague terms here, which I think actually exemplifies the challenge we're facing. But the robustness of adult language learners' perceptual and phonolexical representations for these novel contrasts or these novel phonemes can vary independently of one another. And we see evidence of this from, for example, Weber and Cutler, where you can have lexical representations that are effectively contrasting in some way, while those lexical representations end up in online processing being undermined by perceptual neutralization. We also get lots of similar findings for other language pairs. We also see evidence of the reverse, where we get contrastive perceptual representations contacting so-called fuzzy phonolexical representations. And then we have evidence of even more complex situations, some of which I'll talk about today. All right, so we use a number of methods to tease apart these independent contributions. These include online measures like Visual World with eye tracking. In our lab, we use a lot of auditory word picture matching and also lexical decision with and without priming. And interpretations concerning the relative contributions of perception and phonolexical representation often rely on asymmetries of various kinds. So here's an example. We have, this comes from Darcy et al.'s 2013 really important work in clarifying the ways in which we can think about these as being separate, right? This was a really important paper in this work, and so I'm presenting just the perceptual coding argument, or roughly the perceptual coding argument here, where the contrast is perceptually neutralized to the dominant category. And I want to point out that I'm using the words we use to refer to this particular kind of category vary a lot across studies. And so I have this little orange box to remind us that, to my knowledge, we tend to mean the same thing, although maybe we don't. And I'd be curious to know if there are important differences in here. But I'm going to be using them as a reflection of the literature. I'm going to be using them somewhat interchangeably. So we get this dominant category, neutralization of perception to the dominant category, contacting a fuzzy lexical representation. And what this means is that we should get asymmetries of the following type. The best performance should be on when there's a word input containing the dominant X sound, and it nicely matches the underlying X. Then we get a non-word input containing that dominant X sound again, not matching some sort of fuzzy Y representation. Then we get word input for non-dominant Y being perceived as X if it's a case of perceptual neutralization, and it doesn't match the fuzzy Y. And then finally, non-word input Y being perceived as X, matching X. All right. In contrast, we get scenarios that tell us that phonolexical coding is the issue for the learner. So we get a contrast being perceived contrastively, right? We don't know exactly. It doesn't have to be target-like, but it has to be contrastive in some way. But the lexical representations are fuzzy, and they're in fact what's responsible for the reduction in performance. So we get word input of dominant X matching X, word input of non-dominant Y not mismatching the underlying Y, non-word input Y not matching X, and then non-word input X not mismatching Y. Okay. So I put these up here just in the service of demonstrating how we actually draw very different conclusions about the situation based on the existence of these asymmetries and their directions. Okay. And it seems that we are assuming that what native speakers, or so-called native speakers, will do is something like this, where they'll be highly accurate on words, and then just because non-word accuracy is often slightly lower than word accuracy, I've shown that here. Okay. But we know better, right? Native speakers also exhibit these asymmetries. And so the first main question I want to go over is about these native speaker asymmetries. So traditionally, or maybe implicitly, we seem to assume that the representation of familiar or old phonemes that is, the sounds for native speakers or familiar ones for non-native speakers, will lack the fuzziness of unfamiliar or new phonemes representations, right? So we shouldn't see asymmetries by that argument, or at least we shouldn't see asymmetries for that reason in so-called native speakers. And this is implied in studies that lack comparison groups of so-called native speakers. What we can ask, though, is whether asymmetries are unique to learners and unique to difficult contrasts. And of course, they're not, right? So native speakers show asymmetric performance on some of these tasks. And in fact, so do learners when they're processing a contrast we expect to be easy. This has led some to at least remark on this issue, suggesting that it's important to always compare learners' performance to that of native speakers, so that we can clearly identify the asymmetries that are specific to L2 processing, which I think still begs the question of what it means to have an asymmetry in a native speaker. So I will go through the findings of a recent study in our lab, which is one of several that illustrate why we need to think about these asymmetries in native speakers. So we had so-called native speakers of English. They were people who identified English as a language that they considered to be native to them, and or a language that was spoken by a primary childhood caregiver, right? So this is a rather broad definition of this term, and it's based on, as we start to refine the ways in which we want to characterize the linguistic backgrounds of individuals, we can talk about them in terms of identities, we can talk about them in terms of their exposure, and so what we try to do is at least capture both of those in the way that we define native speaker. So we did the classic thing where we created some non-words for the contrast and also for the LR contrast. And we had 18 self-identified Mandarin speakers and 24 self-identified Korean speakers, and they performed just a simple auditory lexical decision task. The Mandarin speakers on these R and L stimuli showed asymmetries for both words and non-words with higher accuracy on L than R stimuli. This pattern is consistent with those perceptual coding scenarios where you get a neutralized perceptual representation of R and L contacting any of a number of different types of phonolexical representations. And one of the important things I want you to note here is that it's actually, in the absence of a priori information about which of the categories should be dominant, we actually have to see differences for words in order to interpret the direction of asymmetry for non-words. And I'll illustrate this in just a moment. Right, so these asymmetries tell us which category is dominant. Our Korean speakers showed asymmetries also for both words and non-words, but actually in opposite directions. So the higher accuracy on R than L non-words, but higher accuracy on L than R words. And this pattern is consistent with them having distinctive perceptual representations, but they're contacting phonolexical representations that contain the familiar L, right? Presumably that's the familiar one based on the word performance, and some sort of neutralized or ambiguous phonolexical representation for R. All right. So if we look, though, at the English speakers' performance, they do that thing that we seem to always assume English speakers are going to do, which is they're really, really good at words, and they are really, really good but slightly less good at non-words. There are no significant differences between the non-word types here. All right. So we have evidence here that the same contrast represented by the same materials and the same speaker elicit three distinct patterns of performance that are dependent on language background of the participants. But the story doesn't stay that cute. Indeed, we end up with our Mandarin and Korean participants on our A and A stimuli being highly accurate on the and words, indeed probably doing something like sealing performance that's obscuring the potential for any asymmetries for those word stimuli, and then the asymmetry for non-words with more accurate performance on a and e words. And indeed, I'd be curious on y'all's thoughts about this for Mandarin and Korean, but figuring out which of these two is likely to be more dominant is not trivial. So we tend to talk about cases where we're pretty sure we know what the dominant category is, but here we don't. In the absence of any word differences, we can't make this argument, right? And of course, the English speakers also do something quite confusing. They show exactly the same pattern with respect to the asymmetry. Their performance is more accurate, but there's a very robust asymmetry for those non-words in exactly the same direction as the learners. So we can ask whether there's some other explanation for why the native speakers are doing this, but it's clear that we can't attribute the asymmetry to being a so-called non-native speaker, right? This poses a real problem for us in understanding that data for the learner groups. Indeed, this high false alarm rate for a and e non-words by so-called native English speakers has been found by others. What's interesting is that Diaz et al. Found the same asymmetry, but actually in the opposite direction than we did. And they very cleverly suggested maybe it was due to the higher English frequency of a and e. Depending on the differences between American and British English, maybe we could make an argument based on frequency, and the frequencies flip between the two dialects, although I would question that. But there could also be idiosyncrasies in their stimuli. And I think that it was Miguel who has, I was hoping you would present that part today. I think Miguel has very cleverly identified the acoustics of tokens as potential explanations for what's going on, and I think that this point is super important because so many of our studies rely on a very small number of talkers, if we even have talkers as opposed to talker, and also just the idiosyncratic properties of the way that person speaks, the idiosyncratic properties of the stimuli we choose, could very well be affecting these. They don't necessarily need to be, but we don't actually test it, right? We're not sure. And of course, asymmetries in perception could provide an explanation for the asymmetries we're observing in learners. And so these peripheral vowels are more readily detected than less peripheral vowels. In fact, this argument has been nicely made before. I think that this hypothesis is supported at least by the fact that all three language groups showed the same asymmetry for these materials. But even if that is what's happening, does that mean that there isn't something phonolexical happening, right? And if there still is for this particular contrast, how are we going to observe it? Right? How are we going to tease apart these very phonetic things from the representational things? All right, so in summary, right, peripherality, statistical distributions of the phonemes, lexical properties of stimulus words, or acoustic phonetic properties all require attention. But ultimately, the utility of lexical decision and other tests that we use is going to depend on understanding why these asymmetries are also observed in native speakers and what we think those mean, right? And it may actually differ depending on the contrast. We may have different complexes of explanations for it. But in any case, the absence of understanding how a group that identifies or has an experience of the language that is different from the learner groups we look at, we don't actually know what the so-called target is, right? And so attributing asymmetries to learners is problematic in the absence of more information. Okay. So, switching gears. The next question I want to talk about is what we mean by representational fuzziness. So as Isabel so beautifully pointed out for us, this notion of fuzziness in the context of representations is actually, it's been super useful for our field to start to really conceptualize the challenge that learners face in a new way. So in our lab, we've been asking some questions, pretty nascent work, but we've been asking questions about like how would we modify our materials and our studies in order to figure out exactly how fuzziness looks, right? Is it ambiguity? Is it neutralization? Is it something else? And indeed, I will go through some of those cases. But first, a really quick introduction to the contrast I'm going to be focusing on. Kyoko Masuda and I, in 2008, had, I was looking at this and I was thinking, we really have changed in our standards of what's enough. So it's interesting when you've been around long enough to go, oh, right, this would never fly today. So what we did was we taught English speakers a bunch, meaning 4, minimal pairs, contrasting short and long consonants, right? Singleton geminate consonants. And these were Japanese-like non-words. And we paired them with a pictured meaning during the exposure phase, and then we tested their memory for the word's forms through a listening task, so auditory word-picture matching, and then picture naming. And what's important to take away from this one is simply that we found a discrepancy between accuracy on the listening and production tasks such that they were better able to perform and this could well be due to cognitive load and other factors, right? It's absolutely essential. But one other possibility, and the one we asserted at that time, was that we had evidence for the partial encoding of the phonological contrast without having yet identified the exact nature of the contrast, right? So knowing things are different, encoding something that captures that, but not really knowing what that thing is. And that would actually, that's consistent with the case where they are performing well on a listening task because they can tell whether or not something matches a representation that is, say, annotated with an asterisk. But when they go to produce that word and they don't know what asterisk means, then phonetically, right, they don't have information to use to produce it in a way that is target-like. So listening accuracy, of course, only depends on knowledge that the auditory input contains some weird sound, and production accuracy requires knowing what that weirdness is exactly. Okay. And then, of course, we get the very nice study done by Darcy et al. In 2013, English-speaking learners of Japanese, also the singleton geminate contrast, and they used the non-words created from real Japanese words, learners at different stages. If you recall those scenarios I presented earlier, I remind you here of the phonolexical encoding pattern. That's indeed exactly what they found, right? So they've provided evidence here that English-speaking learners of Japanese do indeed experience difficulty at the level of phonolexical encoding. All right. So now the question is, what is that difficulty in phonolexical encoding? What is it that they are encoding when they do? So Shannon and I asked just this question. We wanted to know if we could create some FOIL conditions that would allow us to figure out a little bit more about the nature of that weird or asterisk. So if in order to distinguish the contrast of interest from each other in a listening task, all you need to know is that one is good, right? One is dominant, and the other is weird, right? Then we're not actually learning about what weirdness is, right? So what we did was we added a condition where it was weird in a different way. To find out, or to try to figure out the nature of this weirdness. And we did an artificial lexicon study. I'll go through the consonant length experiment first. They learned consonant length minimal pairs, like the ones I was talking about before, and then completed an auditory word picture matching test. And our question was whether they were sensitive to consonant length mismatches at test, but then also whether they were sensitive to vowel length mismatches, right? So if all they had to know was that something was unexpected, something was strange about the word, then they should be equally accepting of vowel length mismatches as consonant length mismatches, right? So now we've vastly improved our lexicon size. So to be fair, it's actually exceptionally difficult for learners within a short period of time to learn very many words, and we've found that when we get into the teens, we are not necessarily buying ourselves more information, but we are definitely making it impossible for our participants to learn. So there were 36 English speakers, and of course, through experiment or error, 13 of them only heard the materials in one ear. So take that for what it's worth. They did, upon learning all of these words, they performed an auditory word picture matching test. So, of course, they would see something that they had learned was a takey, and then they would hear takey, and that the target response is yes, matched. They would hear takey, and the correct response, of course, is no. And they would hear takey, and the target response here is no. The question is, what do they do when they've learned something is a takey, right? Is takey equally weird and therefore also acceptable? All right, so I'll go through several of the scenarios that we came up with, and this is one of the points I want to make, is that there are a lot of possible scenarios for a combination of what's happening in perception and what's happening in the phonolexical representation, and they make a lot of overlapping predictions about performance. So here, this is the so-called target-like scenario where they're perceiving and encoding the novel contrast precisely. And I want to make another terminological note. Precisely here, you can actually have a very precise representation that is still not target-like. And so we use precisely, I think, to mean target-likely, right? But I think it's an interesting question to ask what exactly we mean. Very precise, sure. You could have a really robust, not useful representation, right? In principle, right? And I'm going to be talking about like logical possibilities. I'm not sure that I'm not sure we're going to identify all things that happen, right? And that's another question I'll raise later. All right. So target-like, basically, just to orient you to these figures, with a target-like representation, if you're perceiving everything in a target-like way and you're representing everything in a target-like way, you should be great when the mismatches with the consonant. You should be great when the mismatches with the vowel. But I want to point out that this is not an unambiguously target-like way of representing these things. Like, let's say they are counting the number of moras in the word. Even within this paradigm, with the additional FOIL condition, we still have an ambiguity. And so people could be doing something that is correct or incorrect, or they could be doing, it depends on what you think is going on with length, right? But I do want to point out that it's not clear exactly what's happening here, and we would actually need additional mismatch conditions in order to figure that out. Okay. So then we have a fuzzy segment scenario. So the representation of the consonant length is fuzzy. And what this should look like is difficulty rejecting only those mismatched consonants, right? So they know that it's about the consonant, and when the consonant doesn't match, then that should be hard. All right, word length scenario. They know the word has length somewhere, right? And so in this case, they should be equally likely to accept takey and takey, right? Okay. There's a word familiarity scenario. We were getting creative, right? And so you would expect this pattern if basically they're just rejecting anything they didn't hear during the exposure phase. This is simply for the point of illustrating that lots of things could be happening, right? An English bias scenario, they only reject words that don't sound English-like, right? That's another possibility. And what I want you to see here is that our data does not match any of the proposed scenarios, okay? So what do? We do a vowel length experiment. Let's see what happens when it's the vowel that has the length contrast. And 11 of them, of course, had the materials in only one ear, unfortunately. And again, what we get is something that doesn't match any of our predicted scenarios. So our takeaways are, well, people were doing really, really well when the word was what we call super long, right? It has the long vowel, when the mismatched item has a long vowel and a long consonant. And it's possible that there was just something super salient about that. And that performance on that word was obscuring any other patterns that might otherwise have emerged. But again, this is important, right? If what we've got is multiple simultaneous phenomena, we actually still need to tease them apart. And of course, we have this issue where our data aren't neatly mapping onto our hypothesized scenarios. So we asked, what else is logically possible? I'll take a quick detour and go through the scenarios we fleshed out in our 2021 paper. We hypothesized, and this is not as you'll see, we are not constrained by even this set. But what we're getting is this proliferation of possible scenarios. If we say, okay, perceptual representations, they can be precise in the sense that the contrast is being perceived, right? Or neutralized in that it's entirely neutralized. And note that these are not the only possibilities for the perceptual representations, but let's just keep it here for now. And our phonolexical representations could be precise in the target-like sense of precise. They could be neutralized, right? They could be ambiguous, where the new category is just, I don't know, right? Like anything goes. And they could be not X. The not X actually, interestingly, does a lot of work with the limited material sets that we tend to use. So as long as A is not you can actually do pretty well on an A stimuli to the extent you can perceive it. But that doesn't tell us anything about whether or not you have phonological content specific to A other than what it's not, right? So are these novel contrasts or these novel sounds being specified only in relation to what they aren't, or do they have their own phonological content? So I want you to see we now have 8 scenarios, and you won't be able to read this. All I want you to see is that they actually make overlapping predictions and some different predictions, but right. And it's going to get so much worse, so I'm really sorry. All right, so that's the end of our detour. But what I want to emphasize now is that these observed patterns in our studies often don't match even these, right? So what we had with the A contrast and the English, Mandarin, and Korean speakers was a case where none of these scenarios showed up. Okay. All right, so I'll talk about our latest study, and this is the one with Shannon and with Joanne. And it's a follow-up on that 2019 study where we did the vowel length and the consonant length to try and figure out what was going on. But this time we elaborated a fuller set of possible scenarios. We increased our sample size, and of course we blamed the stimuli this time in both ears. We also made a number of other smaller changes that actually could be relevant, and that's why I put them here, even though I'm not going to talk about them. Okay. So, what are our additional possible scenarios? We tried to grow our set by saying, okay, well, if what we're going to do is include vowel length contrast and consonant length contrast, the perception of these could actually vary independently of one another. And so now what we need to say is, well, you're either precise or you're neutralized, but you could neutralize both long consonants to singletons and long vowels to short vowels, or one or the other, right? So now we have four types of perceptual scenario. And then these are contrasted with that precise, neutralized, ambiguous, not X, and then we added in length somewhere. That was that word length scenario I presented before, and the fuzzy word scenario where basically there's just no phonolexical commitments at all, right? Which is also a possibility, right, with a quick word learning study. All right, so now we're at 24 hypothesized scenarios. And this just shows you how we plotted the stylized patterns. Basically, we associated ish, which gave a 5% bump in our stylization or a 5% decrement with ambiguous and fuzzy representations because the percepts don't match or mismatch, right? I actually think it's really important for us to figure out what we think these easiness and hardness and ishness should actually mean in this context. But we made some commitments, and then we plotted basically the predicted patterns based on all of these. And so this is just one example. So if you neutralize both long consonants and long vowels in perception to singletons, and you have a neutralized phonolexical representation, this is the predicted pattern. Okay, so we had a consonant length experiment. We go back to all of those, the enormous lexicon, and we use non-object pictures this time. And here's our scenarios. These are the stylized, hypothesized scenarios. Okay. Across the top, we have where both the consonants and the vowels are neutralized in the leftmost column. Then we have consonants only neutralized. Then we have vowels only neutralized. And then we have the precise or target-like representation. And then in the rows, it starts with neutralized, then ambiguous, then not X, then precise, then fuzzy word, and then word length. Okay. And again, it's not terribly important, right? Don't memorize this, please. But it is important for us to see how much overlap we get in the predictions of these various scenarios. And so the colors, the specific colors aren't significant here. What's significant is that each color represents a set that overlaps with each other in terms of predicted directions. Okay. All right, so here are actual consonant length results for the study. And our best understanding of this is that it matches the case where you have a neutralized phonolexical representation and a neutralized perceptual representation. Okay. We're going to dig more into this in a moment. All right. So we also did the companion experiment with vowel length, and here, it's somewhat different, right? The predictions for vowel length are somewhat different. But again, what we're seeing is a whole bunch of overlap in the predictions. Here are the vowel length results, and they actually nicely match the word length phonolexical representation and the precise perceptual representation. However, our individuals were all over the place, and we think it's pretty problematic for us to be drawing conclusions about learners on the basis of these average data, because this is, in blue here, are the individual participants who kind of, if you squint, did the pattern that represents the full data set, right? So we get 13 of our participants doing this. So here, every one of these is a different individual, right? But I'd also like you to observe the variation in what everyone else is doing, right? What we're getting is a whole bunch of different things going on. And in fact, if we look at that original stylized, this is that original stylized representation of the consonant length scenarios. We've got superimposed the colors showing which things are similar to one another, and a check mark means if we squint and are generous, this is attested in our data at an individual level. Okay. So we can ask questions. I mean, maybe we can start asking questions about which ones are actually attested, right? Like which ones actually seem to happen in learners, across material sets and across contrasts. in order to figure out, like, is what's happening neutralization? Is what's happening some sort of just lack of commitment to phonological content at all? Is what's happening the not X scenario, right? And where we encode things in relation to what they aren't. Or does it actually depend on the contrast, which I suspect it does. But I don't think we're going to figure that out by looking only at group means. Okay. And just for fun, here's the number of our participants who did the vowel length mean pattern. Again, it was 13 of them. So even though it was a different pattern, it was still only 13 of our participants who did the group thing. Okay. And then there's that same figure for the vowel length study showing the attested patterns at the individual level. Okay. Did you want to look at that more? I can't tell whether I should be impressed and excited or just really depressed about these findings. So in summary, these auditory word processing studies have substantially advanced our understanding of lexical encoding and perception of novel phonological contrasts, but we are faced with a number of challenges, and I think that in our lab we're trying to figure these things out, but one thing that really excited me about the opportunity to come here was to pick y'all's brains and to see if maybe we can figure out some ways forward together. We definitely need to figure out the significance of so-called native speakers asymmetries. What are the types of reasons that native speakers will show these, and how are we going to understand learners' performance with respect to them? Is it simply that the performance shows, does it have to show an entirely different pattern in order to be something we consider to be learner-specific? And when we talk about things like deficits, right, when we talk about things like learners not being able to do things correctly, it's, well, one, let's not do that, and two, let's consider what the so-called target looks like too. Right? And then, of course, the nature of fuzziness, and when you start asking questions about fuzziness, you get a proliferation of hypothesized scenarios. I mean, it's a fun game to figure out, like, what actually could happen at the perceptual level, what could happen at the representational level. And then we get these overlapping predictions, which lead to ambiguities in interpretation. So some patterns will give us actually no information. In fact, with the, I'll go back to that, when perception is neutralized, we actually have a lot of ambiguity in our understanding of what's going on with the lexicon, right? So I guess I would ask, what is our goal? Are we trying to characterize average grammars? Are we trying to characterize possible or attested grammars? Or are we trying to do something else? I would argue, of course, that the individual matters, and I will emphasize this idea that the performance of individuals is very much in line with an understanding of what the language background of people actually is, right? And so as we move, which I hope we are moving towards or away from this native, non-native binary, we can actually start to find, because we're looking for them now, we can find better explanations for why individuals differ in the ways that they do. But by looking at individuals, we can also figure out, like, are there scenarios that are impossible, right? And if there are scenarios that are impossible, then we've actually learned something about what's possible for a lexical representation or a perceptual one. So I'm interested in elaborating logically possible scenarios, and then with these ceiling effects that obscure our ability to figure out what the direction within non-word performance means, maybe reaction times. Of course, we use a lot of remote data collection now, which makes reaction times not a particularly tenable kind of data, but perhaps moving back to in-person studies will allow us to do that better. Collecting data, of course, from representative samples of languages and humans. And I would end with the question, what can we actually learn here from a translanguaging perspective? This is the idea that learners are simply making use of all of the language resources available to them? And in what way does thinking about it from this perspective open up our ability to understand the nature of their representations?